Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Stephen Hillier, the director of the Erwin S. Channon School of Architecture Archive, and I am pleased to welcome you to this evening's presentation on the Stepwells of Ahmedabad, to be given by Priyanka Sheth, Tanvi Jain, and Aashini Sheth. Tonight, they're going to be speaking about their ongoing collaborative research initiative, which has been to investigate the histories, the current status, and possible futures for these really incredible subterranean water structures. If you have not yet had the chance to take a look at the online exhibition of this material, I really encourage you to take a look at the exhibition site. There's an incredible wealth of information to be found in the text, drawings, and photographs that are presented there. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Anthony Vidler, who will introduce our presenters and moderate the discussion that follows. I'd like to thank Tony for introducing me to Priyanka earlier this year and for suggesting that we mount this really important exhibition at Cooper Union, and certainly for moderating tonight. I'm happy we were able to pivot to an online presentation of this work to a much larger audience than we had initially intended. I also really want to thank Priyanka, Tanvi, and Aashini for providing a powerful body of thoroughly researched work that is really quite astounding. And to my colleague Chris Dirks for his editorial and organizational work in putting this exhibition together. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony Vidler.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Tony Vidler. I'm a professor of architecture here at Cooper Union. And I'm extraordinarily, really happy to be joined by Aashini, Priyanka, and Tanvi this evening. I first met Priyanka at Yale University, where she was gaining her master's degree, and I was doing my stint as the Vincent Scully visiting professor of architectural history there. And I met her at a lunchtime opening of what seemed a very small exhibition. Just after my seminar, I came up. People said I had to come up and look at this exhibition. I came up and I looked at this exhibition, and I have to say I was completely overwhelmed. The scale was small, but the implications were extraordinary. And following the little lunchtime opening, Priyanka and Tanvi and I had a discussion over the implications of the research that they had undergone and the work they presented. And I have to say that I was so excited that I went straight back to Cooper Union and insisted that Stephen look at the work. And what I want to do now is to thank Stephen and Chris for their extraordinary collaboration in putting this on. And for obviously for our Dean Nada Tarani for sponsoring the exhibit. And the exhibit really is extraordinary. And I think Stephen's right. It's going out to a much larger audience, in fact, today than it would have even as a corridor exhibition in our home at Cooper Union. Although I am deeply sorry that we can't be together in person at this event. So to me, this research is extraordinary for its implications, its ecological implications, as you will hear, its historical implications, which are fundamental, its urban and its rural and its regional implications, which are quite extraordinary. But also you will see in this exhibition the most extraordinary set of drawings, drawings that not only architecturally and critically assemble the research that they've done, give us a sense of the decoration and the architectural importance of these stepwells, but also in representational quality. I have rarely seen such beautiful, I think actually since the École des Beaux-Arts in the 19th century, I've rarely seen such beautiful restorations and measured replications of historical monuments. And for that, they have to be absolutely congratulated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of our three speakers this evening in the order in which they will be speaking, and then hand over the reins to them as they share their screens, and we'll show you their distinctive presentations. And then afterwards, we will open the floor. I will have a few questions for them, and we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So Aashini Sheth is an architect and a researcher based in Ahmedabad, India. Her research interests including landscape history, and her recent research project investigated a broad range of water structures in Chanderi, a historic city in central India. She holds a bachelor degree of architecture from CEPT University in India. Priyanka Sheth is a researcher and architectural designer currently working with Bayer Bell architects and planners in New York City. She's interested in issues of preservation, traditional water infrastructure, and the evolution of urban form in Indian cities. She has a Master of Architecture from Yale University and a Bachelor of Architecture from CEPT University in India. Tanvi Jain is an architectural designer and researcher currently pursuing an MPhil degree in architecture and urban design at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. Her design thesis focuses on water, the conditions of semi-arid India, urban water infrastructures for creating resilience. She received a Bachelor of Architecture from CEPT University, India. I now will hand over the screen to Aashini Sheth, who is about to commence these three extraordinary presentations. Aashini.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, great. And can you see the presentation?
Not yet.
Is it visible? Not yet. Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'll be opening today's talk on the past, present, and future of the Stepwells of Ahmedabad by shedding light on a spectrum of different water harvesting traditions. Sorry, yeah. Sorry. Had a bit of a glitch, yeah. Okay, I'll be opening today's talk on the past, present, and future of okay, great. Sorry, I'll start over. I'll be opening today's talk on the past, present, and future of the Stepwells of Ahmedabad by shedding some light on a spectrum of different water harvesting traditions that are indigenous to the semi-arid regions of Western India. I felt it's important to situate the Stepwells along such a spectrum of different attitudes to water, as the Stepwells have deep ecological ties with other local forms of water. Later, I'll look at the role of stepwells in settlement patterns in the region of north-central Gujarat, to which Ahmedabad belongs, and in the social lives of the communities that lived around them. Okay. So what we see here to the left is basically a map of arid and semi-arid regions all over the world. Marked in orange are the semi-arid regions. So what sets apart the semi-arid from the arid is that semi-arid regions do receive precipitations, unlike deserts, which do not get any rainfall at all. But the challenge here is that the rate of evaporation and transpiration is greater than the rate of precipitation. So when they do receive a lot of rain, but during the drier months and hotter months of the year, it evaporates really quickly. So that is what characterizes a semi-arid climate. Also, these regions tend to have very scrubby vegetation. So this sort of a climatic phenomenon is usually found in, it's found mostly in parts of Australia, Africa, and South Asia, which is our area of study. So to the right, you can see a map of the sorry, can you? Yeah, sorry. To the right, you can see a map which has the semi-arid tracts of India marked out. They're mostly concentrated around the western parts and the peninsular southern parts. And for the sake of this conversation, we are going to focus on the western semi-arid patch. So what you see here is basically the states of Gujarat down here and Rajasthan to the north. This big sandy patch over here is an arid desert known as the Thar Desert, which doesn't receive any precipitation at all. And on the other side of our semi-arid region, we have these sort of subhumid regions which have these vast networks of perennial rivers which emerge from the Himalayas to the north and from the peninsular mountains in the south. And what is quite striking here, if you notice, is that the entire country has these network of perennial rivers, but it's distinctly our Western India patch that is lacking in that sort of axis. So zooming in a bit more to Western India, here we have the state of Gujarat and the modern state of Rajasthan. And right here in the center of Gujarat is our city, Ahmedabad. Topographically, the way the region is charted out is that here to the west, we have the Thar Desert. And then to the east of the Thar Desert, we have a series of hill ranges known as the Aravalis. And it's through these hill ranges when it rains in the month of the monsoon. So you can see on this graph, it's a graph of annual precipitation in Ahmedabad, which stands for most of Western India. There's a sudden spike in the period between June and September. So all the rain that happens in this region is during that period. So when it rains, the water sort of courses through the valleys and ridges of the Aravali Hills in the north. And you can see the rivers, these seasonal rivers sort of flow through the coastal plains of Gujarat, and then finally they meet the Arabian Sea to the south. But these rivers are just seasonal. We don't have them through, they don't run throughout the year. And to illustrate that point, I've laid out these little vignettes which show the seasonal fluxes in the semi-arid landscapes of Gujarat and Rajasthan. So here you can see the sort of rugged hilly outcrops. They're so dry in the summer, but once it rains, they're verdant and their valleys fill up with water to form these large seasonal lakes. The second picture here is the riverbed of the Sabarmati River, which you will later learn it flows through the city. It flows past the city of Ahmedabad. So the river is bone dry for a greater part of the year, but when it rains, it swells up, and to the extent that it even floods over onto its into its basin. And yeah, you can see over here it's a sort of flooded landscape, which is very scrubby in the summer, but it's overflowing in the monsoons, and then it recedes. So that sort of captures the essence and the palette of the region that we're dealing with here. So the challenge posed by most of the semi-arid regions is that they receive all this rainfall in 4 months of the year. But the problem is that because it's a semi-arid region, all that water evaporates rather quickly, which is not an issue for other parts of India because they have perennial rivers. So it's interesting to see how human settlements have adapted to this challenge over a period of time. So here, these are pictures of ruins from an archaeological site known as Dholavira in western Gujarat. And this site is regarded as one of the largest and greatest cities in the Indus Valley civilization. The site is known to have been occupied since 2650 BCE. And what you see over here is it's a very, it's not even semi-arid, it's actually an arid climate that this site is located in. And you can see how humans in this settlement have modified and altered the landscape to hold water in the months that it does fall. So to the left, you see is a sort of it's an excavated basin lined with stone with with single flight of steps. So during the monsoon, it fills up, and then over a period of time, it dries up and the water level recedes. And as the water level recedes, you can walk down the flight of stairs to access greater depths. And a little further ahead, at the base of this very reservoir, is this little hole in the ground, which goes deep into the earth and taps into a groundwater spring. And a small flight of steps leads down to the water in this well, essentially. So that is sort of our prototype for a step well as we know it. A well of water with a flight of steps granting access to water as the levels fluctuate with the season. So these images are a testimony to the region's ingenuity for developing adaptive systems and structures for dealing with this challenging climate. Here again, I have curated two pictures. To the left is basically it's a large rock-cut tank in a hilly fortress known as Nahargarh in Rajasthan. This was built in the 18th century, and you can see it's been sort of hewn out of the rock following the veins of the natural land formation, and it collects water from the valleys of the landform, and it's just sort of channeled in through this ramp, and it pulls in into the structure. And similarly, on the right-hand side, you can see a long stepped corridor that has similarly been hewed in through the landform, and it leads to a pool of groundwater at the other end. So this is also a structure in a hilly fortress known as Uparkot in Gujarat. So by no means are these the oldest specimens of reservoirs or stepwells in the broader Western Indian region, and nor are they regarded by historians as the grandest or the finest, but they say a lot about the sort of rudimentary needs and the effort that goes into altering challenging geological landscapes just in order to access water. On the other hand, here we have another reservoir. This is called the Kankaria tank. It's in Ahmedabad, and it's a large 77-acre tank with big, massive inlet sluices that bring in water from all kinds of corners into this tank. And on the right-hand side, we have a stepwell known as the Adalat stepwell, which is also in Ahmedabad. It's more or less contemporary to the Kankaria tank, and it's renowned for its great depth, its complex architectural arrangements, and its elaborate ornamentation. And these two structures are regarded by historians as the grandest and finest specimens of their type. One exclusively for capturing and storing surface water, and the other one exclusively for tapping into groundwater. However, in this context, it's important to acknowledge that the sort of architectural vocabulary of water structures that evolved in this region is not exclusively evolved for surface water and groundwater. We have a whole range of structures that navigate different kinds of water sources. So I'm going to, from this point on, take us through a journey from surface water to groundwater and everything in between. So here, this is another tank in Ahmedabad. It's known as the Sarkhej tank. It's built in the 15th century. And as you can see, it's a rather shallow tank with these sort of stepped embankments on all four sides. It has a regular geometric shape. Down below, you can see it has these large sluice gates which bring in water, flood waters from another nearby water source. So, and there is a large palace, sorry, there is a large complex of mosques, tombs, and palaces that are built overlooking this grand tank. So it's a very imperial, it's a very regal gesture towards water. These are some archival images which give us a sense of historic context. You can see some of the ramps in the tank were used by elephants to sort of walk down and have a dip in the water. And it was also navigable by boats. There used to be water sports that took place in this tank. So here, if you look at this structure, it's known as a kund. This is the Modhera Kund in Gujarat. And you can see in its section, it's a little bit deeper and smaller in surface area than the tank that we saw before. So as I told you before, that it's typical of a semi-arid region that even though it rains, there is a lot of loss of water that happens to evaporation. So one of the responses that we see in the region is sometimes instead of building large open tanks, we have these sort of deeper sunken tanks with these complex stepped arrangements, which serve to buttress the thrust of the earth. And you can see in this tank also, it's situated in a pretty elaborate architectural setting. It's situated next to a complex of temples, and it has these little miniature shrines that have been erected all over the landings and the steps of the tank. So the sort of repetitive rhythmic movements of the steps also alludes to the ritualistic aspect of pilgrims sort of circumambulating the tank and visiting each shrine as they go along. Here, this is another alteration of the kund. You see here the structure is similar. It has these terraced stepped walls, but you can see it's a whole lot deeper than the last structure that we saw. Again, in an effort to lose less water to evaporation as you increase the depth but reduce the surface area. And you can see that this structure, as a matter of fact, it happens to have a little shaft of water, of groundwater. So what it does is it collects rainwater during the monsoon, and as the rainwater evaporates over a period of time, one can still walk down to the greater depths and access the water that comes out of the ground. Yeah, this is another example of a kund. This is in Kaparganj, Gujarat. So here we see it's similar to the Modhera tank in depth. Again, it has a lot of these little niches and shrines carved into it. There is a monumental gateway, which sets the stage for the tank. But you can see it has two attached well shafts. There's one at the base of the tank itself, and there is one which is built around one of its sides. So here the tank and the well begin to take two very distinct identities. And this is just these little vignettes show the seasonal fluxes in the tank. So the first image is the tank perhaps just after the monsoons. And then you can see maybe around come December, the water level starts to recede. And then come May, it's bone dry, and all you can do is access water from this little well shaft. So here we see what we regard as a classical stepwell. This is the Queen Stepwell in Patan, Gujarat. It's regarded as by many archaeologists and historians as the greatest well monument ever built anywhere in the world. It features on the 100 rupee note, currency note in India. So it's a great matter of national pride. So you can see over here, it still has the essence of a tank. You can see it in these sort of in the plan, you can see it in the triangular step arrangements. But there is a very clear axial dimension that is beginning to emerge here. There is this sort of 5-bayed stepped corridor, which leads to a large bell shaft at the end. So we can see how the form gradually evolves. And another notable feature of the stepwell is that it's profusely ornamented with all sorts of figural sculptures and motifs. Some of them are religious, some of them are just amusing and anecdotal. So it's it begins to take on a very social and spiritual dimension. It's not attached to a temple complex or any other religious complex on the outside, but you begin to see those sort of symbols spilling into the tank itself. Here we see a very, very classic, typical step well, the kind that is very commonly found in Ahmedabad, as you will later see. It has a very clear axial form with basically it's a step corridor which is sandwiched between two retaining walls, and as you walk down the corridor you pass through um, alternating experiences of light and shade, which is quite an enigmatic experience. And as you come down to the lowest level, there is a little shallow pool which acts as a settling tank for any organic material that comes rushing down with whatever rainwater falls through the openings. And then finally, you reach the well shaft. And as you can see, this is a very modest, staid monument. There are you don't see the sculptural splendor that you did with the previous well in Patan. And this is the well form as it gets even simpler and more rudimentary. What you see over here is a step corridor, which as it reaches the well shaft, it begins to spiral in helically within itself. So you can see that the component that the sort of the component of the stepped corridor is becoming less imposing. And finally, here we see the spiraling taken to its epitome. This is a well known as Hariopuo in Halisa, Gujarat. And basically what you have over here is a spiral stepped corridor that winds around the well shaft, and there are these little balconies that look in towards the well. So it's a very insular, it's a very private expression compared to these sort of large public stairways that we saw in the previous versions. And also with previous step wells, say for example with the Rani Ki Vav, you can see how the step corridor is quite large, it's quite broad and quite deep. So it has a lot of potential even for holding rainwater when it does rain in the monsoon. But with something like this, its function has been, its scope has been reduced to merely acting as a well. It does not have much scope for storing water like a cistern, the way the Rani Ki Vav would have, the Queen Stepwell would have done. And finally, here you see a very simple rudimentary draw well. All you have is a cylindrical shaft that goes into the ground, and this is very typical of the Shekhawati region in northern Rajasthan, which tends to be much drier and more arid than Gujarat. And you have these long ramps basically for a draft animal like a camel or a bullock who would drag a rope with a pulley and drag large quantities of water out of the well. So you begin to see an inversion in the section. Instead of having this thing which instead of having this section which goes in towards the water, here it's a different sort of an expression which is more outwardly. And finally, this what we see over here is a rainwater cistern. Basically, it's sort of a tank which is excavated between the foundations of vernacular house forms in certain cities in Gujarat, like Ahmedabad happens to be one of them. So here you can see the typical vernacular house form typology in Ahmedabad tends to be these sort of courtyard homes. And very often there's this cistern that is excavated under the courtyard. And what it does is the rainwater which falls on the sloping roofs is collected through a pipe, and it's stored underneath the house itself. And there is a little shaft over here through which you can see over here the way this woman is basically with a pulley. She's inserting a little bucket and she's pulling water out of her own private cistern. So this sort of is the other end of the spectrum from the surcage tank that we saw right in the beginning. It's private, and it's small, and it's scalable and modular. You find this happening in, we find about 10,000 of these cisterns throughout the historic city of Ahmedabad. And now I'm going to head towards the second part of my talk. Before we were talking broadly about the Gujarat-Rajasthan region, and now I'm going to look more specifically at the region of North Gujarat that you see marked out in this map, which is where Ahmedabad happens to be located. So this that you see here is Ahmedabad. What you see is in this region, there is you see the typical settlement pattern that is indigenous to this region. So we have some settlements that spring up along the river. So Ahmedabad famously is situated on the eastern bank of the Sabarmati River, which is seasonal. And then here we see the settlement of Vadnagar, which is not next to a river, but it chose to surround itself around this natural lake. And similarly here up on top, we see a small settlement known as Meta. It's just a little agricultural village, and that too has its own tank. So there is a very distinct.
No, I am. But
there is a very distinct attitude towards the natural watercourses and natural depressions in the terrain, as settlements tend to cluster around them. So we did a series of these illustrations to kind of understand what are the common patterns that occur in the region. So typically a small agricultural settlement of the scale of Meta that you saw over here, you would have these dwellings that tend to so in a typical small settlement of that scale, which is basically relies on agriculture or some sort of artisanal occupation, we find that these settlements tend to emerge on higher ground, so somewhere on the along the slopes of the gently undulating mounds in the terrain. And typically the highest point of the settlement is marked with a place of worship. And on the lower grounds, we find their farmlands. And here you can see a Google image which depicts one of these conditions. This is a small village known as Tintoi in North Gujarat. And the farmlands tend to be irrigated with these little farm ponds and these little dug wells, which tend to co-occur. And as you walk further below to even lower land, most of these agricultural settlements tend to be located next to natural ponds. So we see one such condition here. The pond is it's a little bit of a walk away from the settlement. And typically the villagers who live here, they tend to use the water of the pond for a variety of functions. So for example, people come to bathe and feed their cattle to these village ponds. People come here to wash and dye their clothes and their vessels. Funerary rituals typically tend to take place on the banks of these natural ponds. So you can see over here, there's a cremation rite taking place. So there were a very specific set of functions that were reserved for the natural ponds, which typically involved some form of organic waste. When you have animals coming in to take a bath, or you have people dyeing clothes, it's natural that the water is not going to be of the best quality. So in this case, what happens is, for most settlements, they don't just rely on natural ponds, but most settlements tend to prefer wells and stepwells as sources of drinking water. So typically between a pond and the settlement, you would find a stepwell located. So here you can see the images of these women who are walking up from their daily task of collecting water. In most South Asian societies, the daily chore of collecting water for the household was incumbent upon women, and it continues to remain so, which will my colleague Tanvi will further elaborate on that topic. And you can see in this picture especially that it's not just a place for water. The form of the stepwell itself, with its sort of multi-tiered pavilions, which offer a place to sit in the shade away from the heat and um, grime of the semi-arid climate, it's also a social space rather than just a utilitarian place where you come to fetch water and you um, go back. So, sorry, yeah. So it's important to note that as opposed to a simple dug well, a stepwell has a much greater programmatic function as a social and a public space. So stepwells would be frequented, of course, by women who came to fetch water, and they were often the only one of the few public spaces where women could congregate in societies, in historic societies. Stepwells were also frequented by travelers. So if there is a caravan of traders, or if there is a group of pastoralists who happen to be walking long distance in the heat and the sun, they would usually park their caravans around a stepwell, and they would refuel themselves, and sometimes even stay behind in the stepwell and use it as an overnight shelter on their long distance travels. So you can see over here, many of the stepwells have these sort of articulated gestures, such as the parapets between the columns being articulated as benches, which says a lot about how the social dimension was very deeply ingrained in the ethos of this water building. Many stepwells had these sort of drinking troughs for animals, for cattle. So they did not just, and the water drawn from the stepwells would be channeled into these troughs. Often some of the surplus water, the spilled over water, which people missed, would be channeled into these troughs, and it would be consumed by animals. So it wasn't just, the stepwell doesn't just serve people, but it also serves animals. I'll just briefly dwell upon the process of construction. So normally the way a location for a stepwell is chosen is that it will be chosen on the basis of evidence or signs provided by the surface vegetation. So if you see a deep-rooted tree thriving somewhere, it's a sign that it's a place where you could find an underground spring of water. So the process begins by digging a deep pit, and you keep digging, and the surplus soil is pulled up by these animals who were pulling, and you keep digging till you hit jackpot, till you hit spring of water. And then these wooden rings are suspended into the ground, which serves as a scaffolding. So people would, the stonemasons would get on top of the scaffolding and build the stepwell up tier by tier, build the well shaft up tier by tier. And as far as the step corridor is concerned, the way it would be built is that they would dig the excavation, and then the earthen walls would be shored using some form of scaffolding, or maybe sometimes mounds of soil. And they assemble tier by tier. They assemble these stone pavilions, which are constructed in mortarless techniques. So if you look at this exploded axonometric drawing over here, you can see how most of these stone elements, if you look at right from the column to the joists and the slabs and the beams, everything is constructed in interlocking stone elements, which is a very consistent architectural vocabulary of this region, not just for wells, but you'll also see later for our temples and mosques and many of our other historic structures. There were also different kinds of mechanical devices that were used for lifting water in large quantities out of the well. Of course, you could walk down to the well using the stepped access, but if water had to be drawn out in large quantities, you would typically have a sort of a water wheel, which is a geared mechanism using a draft animal that would go round and round in circles. And you would have a garland of pots, which would go on in a rotation and lift water up and empty it out into a channel. Or you would have a draft animal that would pull water up, pull a little leather bag by walking along a ramp and empty out the water into a channel or a trough. As far as the social mechanisms of water distribution are concerned, there was a community of people known as Bishtis, who basically their main occupation was to fill water from stepwells. They would fill it in these large leather sacks, and they would go around offering water to people. So this is a phenomenon typical of certain urban centers. You wouldn't find this so much in villages or small towns, but in big urban centers you would find them. And typically you'd also find these Bishtis moving along with traveling caravans. So they would carry water for traders or for soldiers as they're traveling long distances. So you can see it's a very busy activity. There's a whole bunch of them trying to stake a claim on the well altogether. And in the last picture, you can see how he's offering a man a little sip of water with his little leather carrier. And on an ending note, I wanted to highlight one of our main research inquiries and observations. So what we observed from looking at a lot of different settlement patterns and stepwell locations all around the north central Gujarat region is that very often we find that a stepwell is located right next to a village pond or in very close proximity. So you can see over here, these are just 4 of many such instances where a stepwell is right next to or very close to a pond. And the reason why this happens is that the surface water collected in this natural depression percolates into the ground, it percolates into the ground over a period of time, and it replenishes the aquifer. So here we've depicted a sort of a abstract impression of how an aquifer might function. And the water which percolates into the aquifer is then further tapped into using a stepwell. So it's a synergetic ecological relationship between groundwater and surface water, which is very essential to this region. The pond and the stepwell together, they tie the settlement down to the depths and the surface of the earth, and so they serve a very crucial function for the survival of human habitations in the region. And I think at this point I'm going to ask Priyanka to delve more into the present scenario of a lot of these stepwells in the city of Ahmedabad.
Can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Aashini, for the breadth of information that you shared. And I would also like to thank Professor Vidler and Stephen for the wonderful introduction. So in this part of the talk, I will be focusing on the stepwells in the city of Ahmedabad, which I have been documented in the online exhibition on display. So this is specific to the exhibition itself. We saw the settlement pattern of North and Central Gujarat, and the city of Ahmedabad emerged on the Sabarmati River in 1411. Sultan Ahmad Shah, the ruler of the Gujarat Sultanate, built a citadel along the Sabarmati, and Ahmedabad grew into a dense walled city. So to to the left of the screen, you can see this hand-painted map of Ahmedabad, and you can see the walled city. That's the river. It's not oriented true north, but that's the walled city. And these are the distinct settlements or the suburbs that were outside the city. And to the right, you can see the river in this foreground with traders and pastoralist communities on this bank of the river and the city beyond. So the citadel was strategically situated on the eastern bank of the river. Stepwells were also built within the walled city and outside of the walled city where these historic suburbs or hinterland settlements and villages were there. So this map shows these little settlements outside the citadel. And to make this map, we actually looked at historic maps, travelers' accounts, and we superimposed the stepwells that we documented on the terrain. So in a way, this map conjectures the historic and the pre-colonial landscape of Ahmedabad. Before I get into the city and the stepwells, I think it's important to understand the river. And Aashini talked about the seasonal nature of the rivers. So in the summers, the river contracts and the riverbed was used for a host of activities such as washing and drying of clothes, textiles, seasonal fishing, and even farming. And these images capture that at the host of activities. So the settlements that I described in the previous slides, which were outside of the walled city, have now been inundated by urbanization and are now incorporated within the metropolitan limits of Ahmedabad today. This Google image that you see is Ahmedabad today. This red border, this red area marks the walled city, so you can see how much the urban sprawl has taken over starting the 20th century. And in the red are the stepwells that we documented for this exhibition. Satellite imagery was an important method for us to identify the former historic settlements and, more importantly, the adjoining reservoirs and ponds, which often indicated the presence of stepwells. Many of these lakes have been filled in or built over. And to locate these stepwells, we would first locate the reservoir or the pond, which you can see these little blue dots in the landscape, or rather urbanscape, I would say now. And then we would go to that location and look for the stepwell. And very often it happened that we would discover that the stepwell had been built over or buried. And in the process of traversing the city, going around the city to locate these stepwells, we had chats with the people of Ahmedabad who lived around these stepwells. And in our conversations with them, we would say, oh, we are architects and students interested in studying stepwells, and do you happen to know of more? And they would enthusiastically refer to a stepwell that they knew of from their childhood days. And many times they even joined us as we went looking about for them. So for about 7 or 8 months, this was our routine, just roaming around the city, locating stepwells and asking as many people as we could along the way if they knew of more. So the people of the city were instrumental in helping us locate these stepwells. This is our team, and this is us in the process of documenting. We used drawings, many of which you are seeing in our presentations and in the exhibition, the photographs, sketches, and even film. And it became apparent that the stepwells were a recurrent typology deeply embedded in the city. And this reinforced the need to look beyond their role as relics and to start a conversation about their unique legacy. In 2015, this collaborative was launched by Riaz Tayebji of Anthill Design in Ahmedabad. And this work has grown over the past 5 years. Our collective started by drawing and documenting them. And our first exhibition was a public exhibition in Ahmedabad for the people of the city to generate a conversation about the legacy of these structures. So our team has measured and drawn 17 stepwells in the city. The oldest one that we documented was going back as far as the 11th century, and the most recent one is mid-19th century. And by the 19th century, these structures were already entering a state of decline, which my colleague Tanvi will talk about more. But the variety and scales of configurations was astounding, and it is also as much a result of their specific location and also patronage. So some of the rather large and ornate ones were commissioned by noble men, women, wealthy merchants, and the more modest structures were probably built by the local community to meet their water needs. Many of the structures that we looked at, of course, there are inscriptions in the ones that are intact, but many of them we cannot even necessarily date them as to how old they are. So we noticed that those within the walled city were typically smaller than the ones outside of the historic urban core. And in these diagrams, you can see the open to sky areas that we diagrammed, the bay proportions in the short section, the number of columns in the stepwell, the angle of descent, the number of steps, and the fewer the number of columns, these structures were actually supported by arches. So there is a variation even in the structural systems that held the stepwell and the walls as braces. So I'm going to now get into the current condition of the stepwells in Ahmedabad and the specific with some specific examples. This is the Rudabaini Wow in Adalach, which was built in the 15th century. Aashini showed some some pictures of this, and it's intricately carved and one of the few stepwells that we looked at that actually had water. Now, Adalach was an artisanal village and a crucial halting point along the trade route to the port of Khambat, which is further south on the coast, and it was an important textile center. These images show the octagonal well shaft and the pool of water. And at this level, where this picture is taken, we are already 5 stories below ground. The stepwell is intricately ornamented with exquisite sandstone carving, featuring patterns and animals and figurines. And it was commissioned by a noble woman, Rudabai, and an inscription in the stepwell states that the patroness provided funds from her own personal treasury for the constructions. Many of the stepwells in this region were commissioned by women, and this has been wonderfully elaborated in the work of the scholar, Dr. Purnima Mehta Bhatt, whose work we have referred to extensively. And what was striking was that she emphatically challenges the historical stereotype of women as passive by shedding light on their agency as patrons of these fabulous structures and frequently as the sole donors to the stepwells. However, it was the daily routines of many ordinary women that linked them directly to the stepwell. Their social lives were interwoven with these structures as the routine task of fetching water was relegated to women. And as Aashini said, it's still true in many parts of the subcontinent. Even today, this labor is performed by women. So stepwells became social and recreational spaces where women enjoyed uninhibited the company of each other in the cool depths of the earth. At the stepwell, women would share their joys, sorrows, discuss politics, and seek the companionship of other women. So in this photograph to the left is a 19th century picture showing women fetching water at the Rudabaini Wow. And the one to the right is our photograph, which shows women as tourists now at the stepwell. It's a very touristic stepwell now. This is a plan and a section of the stepwell itself, and it is preserved by the Archaeological Survey of India and is designated a monument of national importance. And here you can see the before and after pictures of the restoration work that was undertaken by the Archaeological Survey of India. This is another stepwell that we documented called the Bai Harir Niwao in Asarwa, and it's as the stepwell in Adalach, it's intricately carved. And the inscription suggests that it was commissioned by Bai Harir. Now, while her identity is contested, most historical accounts say that she was the female superintendent of the Sultan's harem. The stepwell is also maintained by the Archaeological Survey of India. And as you can see in this picture from, again, the 19th century and 2018, the structure is more or less unchanged. And this drawing shows the stepwell. You can see it goes down 5 stories. And it also is adjoining a mosque and the tomb of Baiharir. Now, this one is called the Jethabai Wow, and it can be traced to the historic suburb, the suburbs that I mentioned in the beginning, outside of the walled city, and was built in an orchard in the 19th century over there. And this suburb was well known for its fruit produce. So the stepwell actually irrigated an orchard. In this photograph to the left, you can see the water level, and this is actually the upper pavilion of the stepwell, the one that is closest to the ground. And in 2018, we took this picture where this is the lowermost. We're pretty close to the well shaft, the well itself. And again, one of the few stepwells that has water, but just the level, the difference in the water table is evident, and it's a sign of the plummeting water tables in Ahmedabad. Again, maintained by the Archaeological Survey of India, they have these gardens around the stepwell, irrigated by a bore well, while the rest of the neighborhood is interestingly water stressed. They have undertaken restoration as recently as 2017 over here, and you can see the wall has been repaired and how they're trying to replicate some historic elements like the stone ledges. And so in this drawing, the historic photo that I showed, the water level was up here where my cursor is. And when we went, you were looking at this lowest level right there. So that's the level that's how much the water has dropped. And this is the last of those preserved stepwells, which is where the state is the stakeholder. And this is actually preserved by the Gujarat Archaeological Department. It's got these distinctive arches which brace the parallel retaining walls. And it was built in 1723. You can see the L-shaped configuration of the stepwell more clearly in this drawing. And this is also, interestingly, within the walled city. So it is rather compact. Like I said, the stepwells we found within the walled city were typically smaller than the ones outside the historic walled city. And this colonial era building sits perfectly within the L-shaped configuration. So there has been a lot of building over of stepwells, and you will see more explicit examples of that. This is an interesting stepwell. It's interesting because it's converted into a temple. And this is the lower part of the stepwell, which is intact. The original structure hasn't been changed as much. But the moment you go to the levels above is when the transformation has occurred. So you have these, the temple, which occupies the upper pavilion, and they have the community that maintains the temple has added these red tiles. These are pots used by women to perform rituals related to the goddess. So the stepwell doesn't have water, but the women still come here to perform rituals. And interestingly, all the stepwells that have been converted into temples are temples to the goddess. So the feminine aspect is still embedded in these structures even today through ritual, through the temples and the temples of the goddesses and the rituals that women perform at these temples. One of the other pavilions of the stepwell, there's an informal community that has grown around it. And this old man, this is his daily siesta spot, right above the staircase that leads to the main well shaft. So this, you can see the upper level where the temple is there, and this is the intact lower level. And the part that is intact, it displays significant carving, though not as much as, let's say, the one in Adalaj or the Queen stepwell, but it is quite intricately carved. And our team made these drawings where we documented all the carving in this stepwell as well. And now we get into another stepwell, which is again a temple dedicated to a goddess. It's called the Mata Bhavani Wow. It's an 11th century stepwell. And it houses many small shrines all along the stepped corridor, starting from the beginning inside. And you can see these recent figurines of the goddess, tiled tiled images of the goddess on the wall. So this is a more explicit conversion of the stepwell into a temple. And in the well shaft is this is the main shrine to the goddess, and you can see the level of the additions of the shrines and the pots and everything all along the stepped corridor. This is maintained by the community that resides around the stepwell, and they lovingly take care of the place, and it's thronged by pilgrims throughout the year. And this is the last of the stepwell temples, as I would call them, that I'm showing. So this is an example where the well shaft is intact, but the rest of the stepwell has been completely, it's unrecognizable as a stepwell. So these are the figures of the female deities in the Khodyar Matani Vav, and the well shaft is again intact, much like similar to the well shafts that we have seen in some of the other stepwells. We were stunned when the priest of this temple actually opened this little door and revealed this well shaft to us. And we were absolutely thrilled to see the well shaft intact. So in this drawing, you can see the additions that have been made for the purpose of the temple. You can see all those goddesses, the figures of the goddesses, shrines, metal railings and whatnot. And then the well shaft is intact. So while the stepwell itself is unrecognizable, in this section, you can still see the diagram of the stepwell. Of course, the open to sky volumes have been filled in by these continuous slabs. So a lot of the original structure has been altered, but these columns are still intact. And unfortunately, on the other end of the spectrum, you can see stepwells like this in the walled city. This one lies in a neighborhood called Doshivada Pole. It's one of the historic neighborhoods driven by community identity in the walled city. And this stepwell lies on private property, uncared for and dilapidated. The stepped corridor is inaccessible, and our team had to literally jump into it from the parapet wall to be able to document it. So in this compact brick structure, water was previously drawn from this narrow well shaft. This is the short section via the adjacent courtyard. And unfortunately, it serves as a neighborhood dump and has been partially built over. So the drawing shows how narrow the stepwell is within the dense fabric of the walled city. Within the informal settlement of Vasna, this is another neighborhood in Ahmedabad, is this, again, a very narrow and a modest structure. When I remember when we tried to trace this stepwell, we were told of this stepwell when we were at another stepwell, and the priest over there said, "Why don't you go look for this one?" And he gave us these nebulous directions. So it has an inconspicuous approach through a recycled furniture shop, and the narrow streets actually made it rather difficult. But we were again super excited when we found this. We saw the structure and eventually made it there. Unfortunately, the stepwell itself is squalid. However, this beautiful banyan tree has grown over the well shaft, and you can see the settlement around and the narrow streets that led us to this stepwell. So the apathy towards this structure is evident, and it has unfortunately not been integrated into the social fabric of the neighborhood. This is the last stepwell that I'm showing from our documentation. There's some more in the exhibition itself that you can look at, but this covers the spectrum of the current condition of these stepwells in Ahmedabad. So this is completely, as you can see, it's ruined, and vegetation and nature has taken over in other ways. And during festivals, the priest from the nearby temple actually lights up lamps. So though the structure is ruined, the idea of sacrality is still associated with the stepwell in some way. And in this drawing, you can see again the ground line because we were not able to determine how deep the stepwell actually is, and the adjoining temples, both temples dedicated to the goddess, but outside of the stepwell. So what I did was cover the spectrum of the current condition of the stepwells in Ahmedabad and what we have documented for the exhibition. It varies greatly, and what we have observed falls broadly into categories of preservation, inhabitation, disintegration, and ruination. However, all the stepwells that we documented have been severed from their former ecological and social networks. Well, not and in some cases both, because the presence of the temple still indicates the presence of a social network, if not the ecological. So whether museified as a touristic center maintained by the state agencies or dilapidated, like some of the examples that we saw, these stepwells are at a risk of being forgotten as providers of the fundamental need for water. That's what these structures were for. And when contemplating the future of their legacy and heritage, with shifting notions of function and identity, it is important to remember the larger ecological patterns of water harvesting structures that were unique to this region that Aashini showed in her presentation, and also the stepwells in Ahmedabad are indicative of. So that ends this part of the presentation, and I will hand it over to Tanvi to talk about possible futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka, for such a detailed presentation. Wondering if you can see my screen?
Yep, we see it.
Okay. All right. So I'll be looking at water futures of Ahmedabad. So let's just start by saying that we have established that stepwells in sync with ponds and tanks sustain settlements in North Gujarat for centuries, like Aashini described in great detail. And this ecology enabled cultivation, trade, and craft practices of the region. The water harvesting structures of various sizes that were built, and they were built at all scales, the scale of a house, a community, and that of a settlement. And a holistic working knowledge of the terrain, surface water, and groundwater was put into practice to enable the settlement to thrive in this region. But Priyanka pointed out that the current state of Ahmedabad stepwells, as you all saw in those drawings, they have all been ecologically severed from their cycles. So I'll briefly touch upon what led to that. So stepwells and other traditional water harvesting systems faced decline or substantial degradation during the early 19th century. And this trend was reinforced by a range of colonial actions, such as imposition of ruinous land tax, commodification of land, and most crucially, the dismantling of community control over natural resources. Now, these policies hastened the destruction of the community institutions that managed and maintained stepwells and other water harvesting structures. And with that, the practices related to water also decayed. In 1817, the colonial government set up a municipal commission to undertake civic projects that actively discouraged the use of stepwells and wells. And in 1849, centralized pipe supply was introduced in the city. This marked the distinction of when the responsibility of water provision shifted from the community to the government, and the state became the provider of water. The photograph on the left that Priyanka also talked about is one of the stepwell in Adalaj, where we can see women going to fetch water. And the one on right is a 2019 photograph of supply pipes in a city apartment. Then in early 20th century, another technology, the mechanized pumps or the tube wells, were introduced by the colonial state, primarily to expand irrigation and support industrialization of Gujarat. Now these hidden points, almost inconspicuous, pump out enormous quantities of water from great depths and at a very fast rate, exponentially faster than groundwater reserves can be replenished seasonally. This technology fundamentally reshaped settlement patterns as communities no longer needed to harvest rainwater for their water needs. And it became the dream of every farmer to dig a tube well on his or her farm. And thousands of tube wells were dug in a unregulated manner across the landscape. And this caused the water tables to plummet, and lakes and wells also dried up in the process. And gradually, the ecology of shallow aquifer eroded, a degradation that continued in the post-colonial period. In the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 1970s, after India's independence from British colonialism, Gujarat suffered multiple droughts. And to deal with these droughts, the Indian government upheld centralized technological solutions to create water security as a matter of great urgency. Here you can see the first Prime Minister of India in 1953 opening the largest dam built in India, where he famously referred to dams as the modern temples of the country, as they became symbols of growth and development. Today, the metropolis of Ahmedabad, with 5.5 million people, is sustained by an expansive and monumental dam canal infrastructure. And this is the photograph of that dam. And copious quantities of groundwater is extracted from great depths using these radial collector wells you can see in the photograph on the right, which are dug in the riverbed. This satellite image shows the sheer expanse of the canal infrastructure. So it basically diverts water from a distant perennial river and transports it over 200 kilometers to the city of Ahmedabad. Here is the dam, which I showed the photograph of earlier, and this is the city of Ahmedabad. And here is the map of the central supply of Ahmedabad, with canal emptying in the river to the north and major extraction wells dug along the riverbed that are marked in red across the city as well. And the orange is the central supply network. The idea of centralized supply, this idea of centralized supply is based on the paradigm of water usage, which is essentially underscored by the wishful idea of limitless fresh water, which is available as a civic right and that is guaranteed by the state. Now, this complete dependence on the state for water also makes its supply a tool for political manipulation, which increases disparity and inequality around its access. These here are photographs of women whose houses are not connected to the central water grid. On the left is women from within the city, and the left shows some women fetching water in the outskirts of Ahmedabad. The everyday struggle and labor of these women points to the manner in which gender, economic background, and religion intersect to make them more vulnerable to the water crisis, as if to walk large distances or rely on private tankers to sustain their water needs. These satellite images show two large barrages that have been recently built only in the last decade to hold perennial water supply of the transported canal from the water that I showed earlier. And a hard edge concrete promenade that is seven miles long has been built, and it's called the Sabarmati Riverfront, which is basically built on reclaimed land of the riverbed and has transported canal water. This mega infrastructure paved over the natural river floodplains and has fundamentally altered the natural ecology of the Sabarmati River. It uses water politically for image making, and the river land is used for commercial finance generation at the cost of disrupting the seasonality of the river flow. Now, as the water demands of the country are on a steep rise, this model for creating concrete riverfronts and transporting water from faraway perennial rivers is becoming the mode in which many other rivers and cities and their relationship is being shaped. And many such riverfronts are being proposed, which is ecologically disastrous. So this diagram here shows how the river was first seasonal, and then because of the concreting and getting perennial water supply, it's now always got water. And yeah, so the next section is going to discuss the way forward as we plan for such infrastructural developments, and we need to question the attitude towards water that are premised on indefinite extraction and central provision to support urban expansion. So these are some potentials within Ahmedabad to rethink policies and strategies of water management, rethink our attitude towards water, and imagine an alternate mode of urban design. I'd like to mention here that these explorations are speculative at the moment, and the idea is not to replicate the stepwell or its form or suggest an impossible return to past practices, but one that argues for a third way forward in which both the historical complexity and the growing demand of a burgeoning population are acknowledged. So this here is the first point, which talks about collecting water where it falls, essentially collecting the rainfall. And rainwater harvesting, interestingly, lies at the intersection of social, ecological, and architectural concerns of water management. And in Ahmedabad, unfortunately, sparse efforts have been made, but they haven't gained widespread traction due to continued focus on centrally supplied water and building monolithic infrastructure to make the central water supply possible, like I showed earlier. The potential, especially in the old city of Ahmedabad, of rainwater harvesting is enormous. As Aashini talked about in the first part of the talk, every traditional house within the walled city has a rainwater cistern. Now, their restoration can represent a substantial additional source of water for the city. And policies such as reducing property taxes for houses with restored tanks can be positive steps towards incentivizing their implementation. This existing system of approximately 10,000 tanks that have been documented, and each with a capacity ranging from 15 to 20,000 liters, which was sealed during the colonial period, can easily be revived. Also, the new houses and neighborhoods that we build must be designed with collection tanks and recharge wells. And the harvesting tanks can also become significant spatial features, which can also explore ideas of passive cooling, the way water moves in the house, and these ideas could be explored further as to how to evolve a vocabulary for building in the region. Now, larger tanks in the medieval institution within the old city, walled city, can also be revived as shared community resources. And stepwells in dense neighborhoods can be desilted to function as community cisterns by collecting roof water and street runoff. Here's one example which has been illustrated. This stepwell Priyanka talked about earlier is in the neighborhood of Vasna in Ahmedabad, and an informal settlement has grown around it. So it is proposed to be reactivated as a parallel infrastructure for water harvesting. Such a revival will save significant expenditure on infrastructure installation from scratch, and collected water can be redistributed for non-potable purposes in the houses. And also create productive terraces. Now, community water cisterns can also become the basis to build new neighborhoods and localize water collection. Now, like Priyanka and Aashini both touched upon how women in the subcontinent are indisputably responsible for procuring water needs of the family. And also, as reported by the UN in one of their reports, talks about how they are more vulnerable to acute water stress. But they're also the first responders in times of drought. Therefore, they are well positioned to be active stewards of shared water resources as we could confront this water crisis. And this was also reiterated by Ashok Chatterjee, who is a former advisor of the World Water Council, in a discussion that we had in the first iteration of this exhibition back in 2016, that if women are not active participants at all levels of decision-making, efforts to alleviate the water crisis will not be as effective. Now, a major effect of massive infrastructural growth and the blocking of watersheds has been that the region has moved away from being flood dependent to being flood vulnerable. This photograph shows Ahmedabad being inundated by a brief period of intense rain in 2017, and soon after hit by a drought in 2019. And this is a trend that is seen in many other semi-arid cities as they increasingly lose their capacity to replenish the water in the ground. Essentially happens because of increased runoff, encroachment of the floodplains, and the paving of natural ground that doesn't let rainwater seep back in the shallow aquifer. Now, to address this, one proposes to create an architecture which is textured and more porous, that negotiates with groundwater rather than separates from groundwater. And the settlement is imagined to be a funnel that channelizes water back into the shallow aquifer. Now, to achieve this better percolation and to recharge the aquifer, the low-lying areas on the west, which essentially forms the green belt, is proposed to be revived by banning building activities and replenishing groundwater through pervious spaces. On the east, the underutilized abandoned infrastructure, the textile mills, which is marked in yellow here, the different sites, could be used to create landscapes that collect, filter, and recycle grey water. This idea of decentralized small-scale water intervention is a counterpoint to a large and monumental architecture that comes from a singular idea that flattens diversity. As the rainwater harvesting structures that Aashini described in the first part of this talk, the local idiosyncrasies led to certain water practices, and they became expressions of the cultural form. Now, such attitudes towards water and water infrastructure can help to evolve a vocabulary for city making that privileges practices over building monuments or creating spectacles by making smaller interventions instead of big monolithic intervention. It engages with seasonality rather than dominate over the ecology, and places an emphasis on small-scale responses that embody sensorial seasonal qualities. The different types, scales, and locations of water structures like pavilions, percolation pits, and filtration terraces help evolve an aesthetics for an overall regional water system. And water, once again, becomes an active element of social space. The pavilions and harvesting tanks can accommodate gatherings and spaces for people. And these interventions could easily be altered based on the changing mosaic of localities that benefit from a large range of efforts at various scales. Another thing that stepwells did, that they were, since they were embedded in the geography and showcased exquisite resolution to provide water, they elegantly engaged the community and crafts of a place. And the visibility of water in stepwells and open wells signaled the approaching of a summer or the time of plenty based on the water levels. And this allowed the community to alter behavior and usage based on the signals of the wells. Now, today, the traditional water harvesting structures have been supplanted by an engineered network of hidden pipes and bowels that keep the water invisible and are devoid of community involvement or any craft practices as such. The loss of this signal is something we need to overcome with urban design by making the invisible water and seasonal fluxes of water visible in our domestic and public spaces. This leads me to the last point. The shallow aquifer, at the scale of a region, the shallow aquifer is actually a humongous water cistern for the city, which unifies the domestic, community, and urban scales. And it has the potential to store rainwater and distribute it in a decentralized fashion at a very low cost and at a very low embodied energy. Now, it is tragic that the transit infrastructure like metros ignore groundwater because it is invisible. What should be done is that urban groundwater institutions should be set up that recognize these linkages and regulate building activities, prevent the digging of illegal borewells, and therefore protect the shallow aquifer. And perhaps even recognize the aquifer as a living, breathing entity, like how Ganga has been recognized. Now, these shifts in attitudes and policies could steer a move towards a socially more equitable, more sustainable, and relatively more water-sensitive city that is self-sustaining and does not depend on transported water. So lastly, the key takeaway is that it is absolutely critical to acknowledge and respond to larger ecological patterns while we design cities. And as has been expressed in the legacy of water harvesting structures and stepwells that the exhibition talks about. And you can visit the exhibition to see more details. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Thank you. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Irvin S. Channon School of Architecture and the School Architecture Archive for hosting the exhibition and giving us this platform to showcase our research. Special thanks to Stephen and Chris as they worked with us while we developed this iteration of the exhibition, and Mauricio for helping us organize the talk. And also I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Riaz, who launched this initiative in 2015 and has been a guide and mentor since our student days at CEPT, for his continual support and yeah, helping us evolve this research through the years. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the chat and your questions. Over to you, Professor Vidler.
Well, that's extraordinary, 3 wonderful talks, extraordinary drawings, extraordinary research. And there are many questions that I have, and some have been on the come up on the chat, and I'd love to begin the conversation with you all. I have been very impressed by the way that you moved from the very early, almost prehistoric origins of stepwells and water conservation at the local and regional level, all the way through to propositions. Propositions which, of course, have opened up the question of local collection, of small-scale collection, as opposed to large-scale collections. And the first question I have, and one or all of you can respond to this, is, of course, one of the fundamental problems in terms of contemporary post-industrial life is that the climation of water from stepwells was a very intensive labor problem. And it was a labor problem that, as you pointed out, fell largely on women. And of course, a lot of the contemporary post-industrial solutions have been to eradicate the labor problem and to develop a flow from centralized and sometimes decentralized sources of water to individual houses. And in many cases, of course, the class structures of cities to individual very high income houses, and forgetting, as you noted in one of your explorations in informal areas of the city, forgetting completely local collections then being dependent again on the labor of women in relationship to tankers which come to neighborhoods and the desperate attempt to salvage water from dried lakes. So in those kinds of questions, in terms of your projects and propositions for local collection and informal collection in relationship to individual houses or individual communities, how do you overcome this labor problem, the labor problem which is totally gender focused and which we would like to, in fact, equalize, in fact, eradicate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that we should remember is that these systems, the system of rainwater harvesting that we've described, was deeply entrenched in social inequality, and the village communities that were internally differentiated by class, by caste, and they showcased a complex interplay of power and power relations involving unequal access to the village commons. So one is not proposing to go back to that where only a certain kind of certain group of people have to fetch water, or only a certain group of people access groundwater. And I also think that it's not going to be possible to imagine a way of life where water has to be fetched. So I think what we have to think is a hybrid model where collection happens seasonally, but access is perhaps still through pipes, but you can start making it a little more visible in the way water flows, and you can be a little more aware of the way water is receding based on season. And yeah, also just when we talk about women as water stewards, I think it's important to say that the onus is not on the women, but it's their experience, and it's their understanding of having done this labor through the years, which makes them, I believe, a little more capable of taking decisions and becoming managing water at the scale of a community and even region. So the important thing to remember is that we propose that they are part of at all levels of decision making, and yeah, that's what we would, I think.
Yes, and I think, of course, the question that you brought up again and again, and which is very fetching, with a certain kind of nostalgia for the community functions of the stepwells, and the way in which they sheltered women, and the way in which they formed communities around the gatherers of water, and also the way in which they became religiously parts of the religion of the community with shrine and so on. And so with post-industrial life, the decline of the religious dominance, the decline of communities of gender, how would you propose in a way to construct a water system which is not simply passive, but also not simply managerial, but also is related to the functioning of a smaller scale community in the city itself?
Tanvi, I'll take on that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that you rightly brought up is the question of labor, and what we think that the stepwells can potentially do is, again, act as rainwater collection points. So can we desilt these stepwells? The idea is not to go to the stepwell and fetch the water. I will just illustrate with an example. I showed the stepwell surrounded by the lawns, right? The one managed by the Archaeological Survey of India. Now, that is a stepwell which has water. Let's start with the ones that have the water. The lawns are actually mandated by the ASI rules. So if there's a protected monument, you're supposed to have, I think, within 100-meter radius. So typically, a lot of these stepwells, even the one in Adalaj, the Ruda Bainiwab, it has these lawns around the stepwell. They are maintained by drilling water through a bore well. So while the stepwell has water, in fact, unfortunately, after some of the restoration work that was undertaken over there, some of the debris of the restoration were thrown into the well shaft, the most inconspicuous space. So perhaps the idea is to test it out at a neighborhood scale. Let's start with the lawns. How can we have a mode of preservation or performative preservation where you can use the water of the stepwell? Of course, you have the pipes to just water the lawn. So the landscape is maintained by the water from the stepwell. And the aspect of the community is interesting because while this monument sits in this community, it is not really related to the stepwell. It's more of a touristic center sitting in the middle of this informal settlement. Can we engage the community that resides around this stepwell, which is a protected monument, as stakeholders? And how about that the landscape is actually perhaps a productive landscape? It produces, I was referring to the fruit trees of Isanpur that we read about in the historic, the accounts of this stepwell. How can we bring those fruit trees back? And that orchard is watered by the water from the stepwell. And the landscape itself acts as a funnel, as Tanvi showed, to put water back into that stepwell. You rethink your landscape strategy of how you don't have this carpet of lawns, which is extremely water intensive. And then it's almost like a demonstration. It can be like a demonstration project at a small scale. And I think the other thing when you talk about labor, I'm zooming out a bit. It is a bit unrealistic to expect people to go to a well and fetch water for drinking. That's what they used to do back then. So using this water of the stepwell for non-drinking purposes within the city, we use water, and not all water has to be the same grade of purity. You don't need to have drinking water quality in the stepwell, but you can use it for landscape. You can use it for, I know Aashini can actually talk a little bit more about this from her research in Chanderi, where the water tables are higher and the stepwell water is actually used. They have the pipes going into the well, but it's used It's pumped out, not a bore well, but for curing concrete. So it's a smaller, it's a town. A lot of the houses are not made of concrete. So as a transition to concrete houses takes place, the water from the step wells is used for curing the concrete. So in that sense, the idea of portability, of fetching water to drink, I think we can shift away from that notion when we think of bringing the water back in the step wells. And I think that also talks to the question of labor. We're not expecting women
So moving
to fetch
from the
water.
question of labor to the question of your research, as a historian, it has always seemed very telling to me that particular kinds of research in history can lead to the activation of a consciousness of problems, not historically, but also today. So the double question I ask is then, what has been the attitude of first the sort of the bureaucracy, the administrative structures of water supply in a town like Ahmedabad to this kind of research, to the implications of this kind of research? And secondly, what is the architectural profession? What has been the response of the architectural profession, which is, you know, what I would regard to be the immediate response to some of the active concerns which you're producing through your historical research. How have you found the response of architects and then the response of administrators and politicians?
I would like to talk about architects because for us, and Tanvi and Aashini, please weigh in on this based on your takeaways from this, the research that we've been doing. I think attitudes to preservation, the ones that are what we prefer as architects, are the first images, those beautiful black and white images that I was showing. And in fact, we learned a lot along the way. Our first exhibitions were purely in black and white, because we were looking at it from a very architectural perspective. The structure is so seducing to us as architects, and when we believe that's what these stepwells should be restored to. I think for all of us, the major unlearning that happened is when we saw the stepwells converted into temples. It's when the community around takes over. They add their tiles, they add their pots, there is so much meaning still embedded in those stepwells, and though they are, I would say, apparently offensive, I would use it in quotes, to architects, the sensibility of the architect, I think there are major lessons to be learned. And when you ask the question in preservation and conservation, whose heritage is it? It's all of us, and that as architects from the city. So we did generate a very interesting, a set of interesting conversations during our very first exhibition in Ahmedabad. And again, of course, most of the conversations were, architects and scholars who were part of that. But I think there is a major unlearning of our biases when we look at structures or alterations made to a structure for architects, which I would emphasize as one of the main takeaways.
Aashini, you showed us the extraordinary network qualities of these traditional stepwells. And in an era where we are totally preoccupied with networks, and especially, and probably unfortunately, too unfortunately, virtual networks as opposed to actual physical networks. What is the potential of your mapping procedures in relationship to traditional networks to activate an idea or ideas of more contemporary networks that might in fact bring to bear the aquifers, bring to bear the local communities outside cities and on a regional scale?
So I can reflect a bit on my experience from documenting water structures in this little historic town called Chanderi, which is in central India. And it's rather interesting because Chanderi was founded in 1407. Ahmedabad was founded in 1411. They were similar regimes. They were walled medieval towns. They both had an artisanal population, which was heavily invested in the manufacture of textiles. But both, so they, at around the 15th century, they started out on the same page, but then around the early 19th century, there was a big segue. So whereas in Ahmedabad in the 19th century, we began to have the traditional occupations transition from something like handloom textile weaving to industrial textile mills. A town like Chanderi, till today, we have people, the entire city, about 60% of people in the town are still invested in weaving textile and also in agriculture. So that leads to two things. Number one, because the town still has the economy of Chanderi is still very much dependent on a traditional um, a traditional industry which is not dependent on fossil fuels and does not need large quantities of water for dyeing and so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons why stepwells have not become outmoded in a city of that sort, which has very aggressively been protected from the influences of profit-based industry. The other thing about a town like Chanderi is that what I noticed over there was that many of the low-lying areas in the settlement have been earmarked as productive landscapes. So you have these little urban farms throughout this dense medieval sort of an urban fabric. So there is an incentive for preserving these stepwells because a lot of them are used for this sort of micro-scale urban farming that takes place in the city. So, and also the people who own that plot of land, they are incentivized by the government for maintaining the stepwells which are on their properties. And yeah, they do a couple, there's some interesting things that I noticed there. So in a lot of the stepwells, the steps as an architectural element have become quite redundant because people don't need to walk down the well anymore. So what I noticed was in many places, they just filled up the step corridor, but they continue to use the well as a well, which is very different from what's happening in Ahmedabad, where we're trying to preserve the conservationists and the archaeological survey are very obsessed with preserving the grandiosity of the carvings and the pavilions and the shrines, but neglecting the component of the well itself, the main element that makes it essentially a water monument, which is very different to what I observed in Chanderi, where they're still incentivized, local people are incentivized to keep using them as very functional water buildings. And a third thing which I noticed historically speaking about Chanderi was that around the 19th century, when we began to have colonial regimes in India, Chanderi belonged to the state called the Gwalior state, which was not a colonial state. It was ruled by, it was administered by a native princely regime. And around the 19th century, when colonial regimes were interested in building dams and intensifying agriculture and intensifying industry through mills, what was very interesting was that I noticed when I was walking around Chanderi, I was reading some of the plaques that are attached to a lot of the dams and the tanks and the stepwells. There were grants being given out by the head of state to keep preserving these structures all the way until the 1920s and 1930s. And they very often had religious associations. So they would preserve a stepwell or a tank which a religious community is invested in, for example. So in a certain sense, I would say they were probably pandering to religious sentiments. But at the same time, it has led to the preservation and integration of many of these structures, even in the contemporary fabric of that town. So from a network perspective, that's what I think about. And I think also what happened with Chanderi was that after independence of India, so after 1947, there was an administrative um, there was an administrative phenomenon called the Special Areas Development Authority, which was instituted there with an intent of retaining the historic character of the city as much as possible from the start on, like right from 1947. Whereas a city like Ahmedabad is coming to that consciousness right now. Ahmedabad happens to be the only UNESCO World Heritage accredited cities in the entire country, and that only just happened recently. So it's only like in the last 3 or 4 years that architects, archaeologists, and people invested in heritage have become cognizant or have begun to panic about the state of heritage in Ahmedabad, because now it's so closely tied with culture-related tourism. Whereas a small town like Chanderi had that, they had a head start when it came to acknowledging the importance of their historic roots. So I think some of those things struck me quite strongly, those disparities.
Yeah. So I have an architectural question for the three of you. Those drawings, which in chat have received incredible acclamation from everybody at this event, they are meticulously drawn to scale. What were the problems involved and the techniques that you used to document these extraordinary objects? Even the smallest ones demand a rather intricate measurement system, I would have thought, to actually bring them to scale in drawing. And I do want to comment on the way in which both the extraordinarily meticulously documentation in a very, very clear way have been related both in section, axonometric, and in aerial view to everyday life, to the way in which they are totally involved in and are sitting in the community that they live in, especially that little one with the tree over the well in the informal community. I thought that the depiction of that side by side with its section and its axonometric showing its place in the community was really brilliantly done. So what were the technical problems and solutions that you undertook for these extraordinary drawings?
Can I take this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, like you pointed out, there are two distinct styles of drawing. One meticulously sort of documenting every carving, and what we used to sort of measure and draw those were very rudimentary techniques. We literally just had a measure tape and perhaps just a laser measure to be able to measure larger heights. And yeah, it involved, I think, going to the stepwell almost every day for 2 to 3 weeks and documenting every little detail. While the other set of drawings, which are a little more evocative in terms of the context, and there was a lot of freedom when those were being depicted, because stepwells were sort of shown in the larger context. And the idea of that drawing was to sort of talk more about what's happened to it and how the community engages and how they have sort of been transformed in today's time by the community. So there's a lot of liberty taken in those drawings to sort of represent the changes, whereas the other drawings, which are clean single line drawings, were more to depict the architectural qualities and just the exquisite nature of these structures. So yeah.
We are always now confined to seeing digital images of them. What is the actual scale of the drawings themselves? What is the size of those drawings?
I think the detailed ones can be like 1:50, something like that.
And because the stepwells are of varying sizes, all of the drawings are different, especially the context drawings. Some of them have been drawn in 100, in the in 1:100 or 1:250. The larger ones have been drawn in 1:250.
Oh, fantastic.
And yeah.
And also, for example, the detailed, intricate carving, the ornamentation drawing, I think some of the details are drawn at, if I remember correctly, larger than 1:50. So the CAD files for these drawings, they have everything. And of course, we chose to draw some in more detail than others. For some, we had just the basic line drawing. The measurements are relatively accurate. And the process of drawing was also, I think, something we learned along the way as we were doing these, as we were documenting. We did start off with the very hard line. You go, you measure, you put it in AutoCAD. And as we spent more time going to these stepwells, we felt that just these set of drawings are not going to do the justice to the story of the stepwell. So we selected, the drawings are not necessarily, except for the one diagram where we had all 17 drawn together, the details in which each stepwell has been drawn, we just, that's where we stopped thinking about consistency, so to speak. So not all of them are drawn with the same carving, but then some of them are drawn more, it's more about the landscape around the stepwell than the carving within the stepwell. So it was a process that there was a significant back and forth over months, I would say, since we started making the basic drawings to.
They do have this incredible environmental vision to them. As I was looking at them, I saw them as a kind of contemporary version of those drawings that I love so much by Lina Bobardi, where she absolutely refuses to exclude animals, people, playful scenes, and even festivals from what will actually quite, quote unquote, now from our point of view, brutalist buildings. And in the way in which the buildings and the play of life are integrated seem to me to be such a really special part of your exhibition. Well, I haven't been following the chat, but I would like to open this up for the last 5 to 10 minutes to the.
I just want to add one little thing about the drawings, that we got really lucky. Sorry, I just wanted to add one thing about the drawings. Yeah, just that we got very lucky in certain situations because we were in Ahmedabad and we were from Ahmedabad. We were able to access, like the drawing that you mentioned, which is the aerial view with the banyan tree. We were able to access one of the houses' terraces next to the stepwells. And that's how we got a wider understanding of what the context is like. And that engagement with the local really helped evoke a sense of some of these smaller stepwells. Yeah.
You're very good at water buffalo. So are there any questions from the audience? And I don't know quite how to moderate this because I can't see everybody. But if someone wants to.
So Tony, I've been reading the chat and kind of there were a lot of questions, and also a lot of audience members helped and answered some of the questions. So there are some unanswered questions, and I would like to call on Arya Exis if you would like to voice your question.
Oh, yes, hi. So my question is, what is the potential role of communities to manage their water resources by the lessons learned by the stepwells?
Okay. Can I take that one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think one of the important aspects that I would like to reiterate here is that, again, the community that sort of surrounded these traditional water infrastructures were differentiated on the basis of caste and class. And we have to be really mindful of recreating these spaces as community structures, because it is very likely that those power dynamics come back to play where certain groups of people have larger stake over the natural resources. Which is why it's tricky when you talk about decentral water structures, and there is no simple solution to it to address this issue. But if you have like local institutions or community level institutions in place that are able to regulate these resources more equitably, it might be possible to have more sensitive, more sensitive ways in which communities can be involved.
There was another
Yeah.
question I saw quite early on from Anirban Adia. It's no longer here. Okay.
Anirban, would you like to voice your question?
What's that?
Would you like me to read Anirban's question? I think it's
yes,
a good
that was quite an early one in relationship to drought and stepwells.
So Anirban Adia asks, is there any historic correlation between construction of wells to drought or some prediction of dry seasons? In India, we see some examples of water-based infrastructure and architecture like the Mausoleum of Sher Shah Suri in Sasaram. Bihar is structured in the middle of a pond, planned and constructed by himself, was built employing local labor during a drought season and created a water supply infrastructure. Are there any such strategic construction related to seasonality, employment, and empowerment?
Can I take that one?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I definitely think from whatever I've studied about stepwells, both from my experience in Chanderi and broadly by looking at historical textual sources, often the ruling elite, whoever holds the purse strings of the treasuries for a region, in times of droughts or famines, often it was common for a ruler, for example, to say commission more public works for two reasons: both to provide employment to people whose occupations might have suffered because of, let's say, if it's a drought, you're a farmer and you can't really farm anymore. So what do you do? How do you occupy yourself? So the building, commissioning a tank, something like that was often instituted or decreed in a time of drought or famine, both to create employment and also to create a potential for harvesting more water, so that you're less vulnerable during the next drought. So it's two birds with one stone, essentially. I remember when I was in Chanderi, one of the stepwells I visited, and I had a Persian translator with me, and he read the inscription out to me, and it said, this well was dug when all the other wells in the city had run dry. And it just so happened to be, from my observation, the deepest well in the region. So clearly it was probably, and I looked up my historical sources, and apparently there had been consistent years of drought during that period. So yes, it was, it used to be a pattern, and it still is a pattern. Like right now, even during COVID, when a lot of urban migrants, people who migrated from villages, left their farmlands and came to work in the cities and have had to go back to their rural origins once again. I've been reading news reports that in a lot of small towns and villages, these urban workers who come back home, they've been invested in desilting their neglected tanks. They've been involved in desilting their rivers. So during times of strife, it is common for people to go back to the roots and to go back to the land, because that is what we really have at the end of the day. And so now these people have a consciousness, for example, the urban migrants, that there is uncertainty about a prospect for a stable occupation in the cities. And so now they're more invested in the prosperity of their lands, and hence they're more incentivized to contribute their labor in these public works, especially during times of social and economic strife.
I actually wanted to, in terms of taking questions, I see Professor Morna Livingston is in the chat, and I think the audience and everyone should know that her work has been one of the textbooks, I would say, on stepwell literature. And I was wondering, since I can see you on the screen, Professor Livingston, I was wondering if you had any thoughts or questions or insights that you would like to share, because we have referenced your book and your work so extensively since years, since we were students, and we still do. We saw some images from your book
Yes,
on the screen. So
thank you so much for your kind words. There aren't too many. I mean, there are lots of small details. One of the things that I think is interesting is the position of the large tanks next to so many stepwells. And Mata Bhavani in particular, there's a big tank next to that was used as a parking lot. The last time I was there, they were parking trucks in it. But it wasn't built on, and it was, could have been returned to a tank, except they'd have to clean up the dirt and probably replace the dirt from motor oil and other things that had come on the ground. But potentially they could have water in that stepwell if they would get the trucks off that space. And there are many, many like that.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing that we're kind of proposing, is to return to that ecology and try and revive this ecology, which in a lot of situations like the one that you mentioned in Mata Bhavani is easily revivable if you just desilt step wells, if you take care of your shared wells and lakes and in the community. And so that is perhaps going to start a move towards maybe going back to this ecology of step wells and decentralizing water at the scale of a community. So yeah.
There's one other thing I wanted to ask you about, and that was the cisterns in the houses, underneath the houses in the Haveli in Ahmedabad. The ones that I was in, they had very poor air quality. They were moist, and many of them had mold and fungus. And is that because they've closed off ways that the air moved? Is that
yeah,
because they studied the buildings more than I did. I was never in one of those for more than a short time.
Yeah, so in the colonial period and also after that, there was a plethora of waterborne diseases, during which the Indian government, and before that even the colonial government, had sealed these stepwells off, these water cisterns under the houses off completely. That's when the quality, and because they were sealed, the engagement and the idea of maintenance and how, because like in their maintenance and cleaning of these wells on a regular basis was sort of intertwined in the rituals. Like every year after the monsoons, before Diwali, is where the deep cleaning of the houses happened, and that's when the water from these structures, these underground cisterns, would be taken out and they would be cleaned. When that regular engagement stopped, and it was assumed that they were a reason, because they were stagnant water. It was the reason, one of the reasons that the waterborne diseases were sort of spreading. They were without much thought, just sealed off. And I think now we're just not used to maintaining that level of engagement doesn't exist. So I think what we're saying is that we also move towards that, like as a society, we are more conscious to and we are more active in the way we maintain our domestic water spaces or community water spaces, and also look at it at a larger scale where the state is involved in maintaining watersheds and yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, that's the...
Yes.
Okay.
Are there any other questions before? I think it's becoming now 8:35 and maybe time to draw this extraordinary session to a close. I did want to comment on the fact of how appropriate it is that your exhibition is here and this coming together at Cooper Union, given the fact that over many, many years, Professor Kevin Bone and his team of students were engaged in doing something which at the time was not seen at all architectural, but was seen as absolutely essential, which was the mapping of the water system that brought from northern New York State fresh water to New York, and the infrastructures and the histories of that system documented with great clarity, and which was followed through with the exhibitions at Cooper of the ecology and sustainability of modern movement structures, where, for example, Brise Soleil would be there instead of air conditioning units. And so we have a long tradition of being excited and stimulated, and our research broadened by exhibitions and research such as the ones that you brought to us today. And I just want to thank all three of you for your dedication. I want to invite you to participate more in the Cooper Union over the next years and decades, and to come back and tell us more about your research as it develops, and also to try to help you in your mission of publicizing and developing the implications, ecological and infrastructural and social, above all, of the work you've been doing. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Stephen, Mauricio, and Chris Dirks, and Nader Tarani Ardeen for hosting this extraordinary exhibition. I just want to say to all of you who are participating, just click on that exhibition and see the images as large as you want to see them. They enlarge very well in the reproductions that I've seen. And it's a wonderful weekend enjoyment for getting out of our Zoom screens and COVID isolation into the extraordinary land of water and conservation and monumentalization of water that you brought to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your kind words, and we really hope to engage with you and discuss as this project
An extraordinary audience. Thank
evolves.
you.
So I think there is one question, sorry, before we go, it's very quick.
Okay.
Is there a catalog being planned for this exhibition?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hopefully it should be out in the
New
Christmas
Year.
season or by New Year.
By New Year. Let's say New Year. By New Year.
Okay, so pass that information along and we'll put it in the announcement page that we had for the exhibition so that people can keep track of it. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for attending, everyone.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.